The autumn of 1774 brought an unusual chill to the Virginia countryside, where the Johnson plantation sprawled across hundreds of acres of tobacco fields. The main house stood like a monument to colonial prosperity, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun, while smoke curled lazily from its many chimneys. But behind this facade of genteel southern life lay secrets that would make even the most hardened overseer cross himself in the darkness. Elijah pressed his small hands against the rough wooden sides of the cart as it jolted along the dirt path. At 12 years old, he had already learned to read the faces of white men, and Master Johnson's expression filled him with a dread that settled deep in his bones. The man's pale eyes held no warmth, no humanity, only the cold calculation of someone who viewed human beings as mere property to be stored and used. "This one's been causing trouble at the Whitmore place," Johnson said to his overseer, a brutish man named Garrett, whose scarred hands spoke of years of violence. "Tried to run twice. They say he can read too. Dangerous combination." Garrett spat into the dust. "The quarters will cure him of such notions, sir. They always do." As they approached the area behind the main house, Elijah noticed something peculiar. While other plantations had rows of small cabins where the enslaved lived, the Johnson property seemed strangely empty of such structures. Instead, there were only a few wooden shacks that looked more like storage buildings than homes. The real mystery lay in a series of heavy wooden doors set directly into the ground, like the entrance to a root cellar, but far more numerous and ominous. The cart stopped beside one of these doors, and Elijah felt his stomach drop as he realized what was about to happen. Garrett hauled him from the cart with unnecessary roughness, while Johnson produced a heavy iron key from his coat. "Welcome to your new home, boy," Johnson said, his voice carrying a twisted satisfaction. "These quarters have housed troublemakers for 3 generations of my family. My grandfather built them during the Indian Troubles, and we found them most effective for maintaining discipline." The door creaked open on rusted hinges, revealing a set of wooden steps that descended into absolute darkness. The smell that wafted up was indescribable, a mixture of human waste, decay, and something else that Elijah couldn't identify, but that made his skin crawl. It was the smell of despair made manifest. "Down you go," Garrett growled, shoving Elijah toward the opening. "And don't think about making noise. The walls are thick, and we're deep enough that even the hounds can't hear you scream." As Elijah stumbled down the steps, the door slammed shut above him with a finality that echoed through his very soul. The darkness was complete, so absolute that he couldn't see his own hands in front of his face. He stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid of what might be sharing this underground prison with him. Then he heard it, a soft rustling in the darkness, followed by a voice so weak it was barely a whisper. "Another one," the voice said, and Elijah realized with horror that he was not alone. "How long since you've seen the sun, child?" I just came down," Elijah managed to say, his voice cracking with fear. A bitter laugh echoed from somewhere in the darkness. "Just came down. Lord have mercy. I've been down here so long I forgot what color the sky is. Name's Samuel. Been in these quarters nigh on 4 years now." 4 years. The number hit Elijah like a physical blow. 4 years without sunlight, without fresh air, without hope. As his eyes slowly began to adjust to the darkness, he could make out shapes moving in the shadows. Other people, other souls trapped in this underground hell. "How many of us are there?" Elijah whispered. "In this section? Maybe 15, 20? Hard to tell when they stop moving." Samuel's voice carried a weight of sorrow that spoke of losses too numerous to count. "But there's other sections, other doors. Some say there's near 100 souls down here in total, spread through all the tunnels." Tunnels. The word sent a chill through Elijah's already trembling body. This wasn't just a single underground room, it was an entire network, a subterranean world of suffering hidden beneath the Virginia soil. As the hours passed, Elijah learned the horrible routine of life in the quarters. Food, if the thin gruel and moldy bread could be called that, was lowered down once a day through a small opening in the ceiling. Water came from a single bucket that was refilled weekly, whether it was empty or not. Waste was collected in another corner, creating a stench that never left the air. But it was the sounds that truly haunted him. During the day, there was the constant murmur of voices, some praying, some crying, some talking to people who weren't there anymore. At night, when exhaustion finally claimed most of the prisoners, other sounds emerged from the deeper tunnels. Sounds that didn't seem quite human. "What's that?" Elijah asked Samuel during his first night, as a low moaning echoed from somewhere beyond their chamber. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "Some say it's the wind, finding its way through cracks in the earth. Others say it's folks who've been down here so long, they ain't quite folks anymore. But I think..." He paused, and Elijah could hear him swallow hard. "I think it's the ones who died down here, and their spirits can't find their way to the light." As if summoned by his words, the moaning grew louder, joined by what sounded like scratching, fingernails against wood, or perhaps bone against stone. The sound seemed to move through the walls themselves, circling their chamber like a predator stalking its prey. Elijah pressed himself against the earthen wall, feeling the cold dampness seep through his thin shirt. Above them, he could hear the faint sounds of life continuing on the plantation. Horses' hooves, voices calling to one another, the normal sounds of a world that might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did him now. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the feeling of sunlight on his face, but already the memory seemed to be fading, replaced by the oppressive weight of earth and darkness and the growing certainty that he might never see the sky again. In the distance, deeper in the tunnels, something that might once have been human began to sing a lullaby in a voice like grinding stone. 3 days had passed since Elijah's descent into the quarters, though time had already begun to lose all meaning in the perpetual darkness. He had learned to navigate by touch and sound, feeling his way along the rough wooden walls that had been hastily constructed to divide the underground space into smaller chambers. The architecture of the place spoke of deliberate cruelty, every aspect designed to maximize suffering while minimizing the chance of escape. Samuel had become his guide to this subterranean hell, sharing the hard-won knowledge that meant the difference between survival and madness. The older man had been a carpenter before his enslavement, and his trained eye had mapped every inch of their prison during his 4 years of captivity. "The whole system runs maybe 200 feet in each direction," Samuel explained in a whisper, his voice barely audible above the constant dripping of water from somewhere in the darkness. "Master Johnson's grandfather, he built it like a maze, easy to get lost if you don't know the way, and even easier to get trapped in the dead ends." "Dead ends?" Elijah asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Chambers where they put the ones who fight too hard, or try to organize the others. Smaller spaces, no food, no water. Most don't come back out." Samuel's voice carried the weight of personal loss. "My brother Marcus, he tried to rally folks to rush the guards when they brought food. They took him to one of those chambers 6 months ago. Sometimes late at night, I think I can hear him calling my name." The food distribution had become a daily nightmare that Elijah both dreaded and desperately anticipated. Each morning, or what they assumed was morning, a wooden platform would be lowered through the opening in the ceiling, carrying a few loaves of moldy bread and a pot of thin gruel that barely qualified as soup. The stronger prisoners would push forward, often trampling the weak in their desperation, while the guards above watched with amusement. On his 4th day, Elijah witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. An elderly woman named Ruth, who had been in the quarters for over a year, finally succumbed to the combination of malnutrition and despair. Her death was quiet, a simple cessation of the labored breathing that had marked her presence in the darkness. But what happened next revealed the true depths of the Johnsons' cruelty. When the guards came for the daily food delivery, Samuel called up to report Ruth's death. The response was a harsh laugh from above. "One less mouth to feed," came Garrett's voice. "Leave her where she is. The rats will take care of the rest." The implication was clear. They were expected to live alongside the decomposing bodies of their fellow prisoners. It was a psychological torture as devastating as any physical abuse, designed to break their spirits completely. But Ruth's death also revealed something else. As her body began to change in the humid underground air, strange sounds started emanating from the deeper tunnels, sounds that suggested they were not alone in this underground world. The scratching and moaning that Elijah had heard on his first night grew more frequent and more urgent, as if something was being drawn by the scent of death. "There's things down here that ain't natural," whispered a woman named Celia, who had been in the quarters longer than anyone could remember. Her mind had been broken by years of captivity, but her words carried an unsettling conviction. The Johnson family, they'd been putting folks in the ground for near 50 years. All that suffering, all that death, it leaves a mark on a place, changes it. Elijah tried to dismiss her words as the ravings of a broken mind, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. The sounds from the deeper tunnels were growing more distinct, more purposeful. Sometimes he could swear he heard voices calling out in languages he didn't recognize, or footsteps that seemed to come from directions that shouldn't exist in their underground maze. The worst part was the cold spots. Despite the humid, stifling air that filled most of the quarters, there were areas where the temperature would suddenly drop, leaving prisoners shivering and gasping for breath. These cold spots seemed to move, appearing in different locations each night, always accompanied by the sound of whispered conversations in voices too faint to understand. Samuel had his own theory about the phenomena. "My grandfather, he was brought over from Africa when he was just a boy. He used to tell stories about places where the spirits of the dead couldn't rest, where too much suffering had soaked into the very ground. He said such places became hungry." "Hungry for what?" Elijah asked, though he feared the answer. "For more suffering, for more death, like they feed on it, grow stronger from it." Samuel's voice dropped even lower. "And I think this place has been feeding for a very long time." As if to punctuate his words, a new sound echoed through the tunnels, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from beneath their feet. It was steady, deliberate, like someone knocking on a door from the other side. But there was nothing beneath them except solid earth, or so they had thought. The tapping continued for hours, sometimes stopping for long periods before resuming with renewed intensity. Other prisoners began to notice it too, and whispered conversations spread through the darkness like wildfire. Some claimed they could hear voices mixed in with the tapping, speaking in the languages of the dead. Elijah pressed his ear to the earthen floor, trying to make sense of the sounds. What he heard made his blood run cold. Beneath the rhythmic tapping, he could swear he heard the sound of digging, as if something was trying to claw its way up from even deeper in the earth. "Samuel!" he whispered urgently. "How deep do these quarters go?" The older man was quiet for a long moment. "I don't rightly know, child, but I heard tell that Master Johnson's grandfather didn't just build these chambers. He built them on top of something that was already here, something older." As the night wore on, the tapping grew louder and more insistent, joined by other sounds that defied explanation. The temperature in their chamber dropped until their breath came out in visible puffs, and several prisoners began to report seeing shapes moving in the darkness, shapes that didn't belong to any of the living souls trapped in the quarters. Elijah huddled against the wall, trying to make sense of what was happening around him. The rational part of his mind insisted that it was all just the product of fear and desperation, the hallucinations of people pushed beyond their breaking point. But deep in his heart, he knew that something was terribly wrong with this place, something that went beyond even the Johnson family's capacity for cruelty. In the deepest part of the tunnels, something that had been waiting for decades was finally beginning to stir. A week had passed in the underground hell, and Elijah had begun to understand why so many prisoners eventually stopped speaking altogether. The constant darkness played tricks on the mind, making it difficult to distinguish between reality and nightmare. But what was happening in the deeper sections of the quarters was becoming impossible to ignore, even for those who clung desperately to rational explanations. The tapping from below had evolved into something more complex, a pattern that almost resembled communication. 3 short taps, followed by 2 long ones, then silence. The sequence would repeat for hours before changing to a different rhythm entirely. Samuel had begun keeping track of the patterns, scratching marks into the wooden wall with a nail he'd found in the dirt. "It's like they're trying to tell us something," he whispered to Elijah during what they assumed was the middle of the night. "My grandfather, he knew some of the old African drum languages. This reminds me of the stories he used to tell." But it wasn't just the tapping that had the prisoners on edge. The cold spots had become more frequent and more intense, sometimes dropping the temperature so dramatically that ice would form on the walls, despite the humid Virginia climate above ground. And with the cold came voices, whispered conversations in languages that predated the English colonization of Virginia. Celia, whose mind had been fractured by years of captivity, had become an unwitting interpreter of these phenomena. She would sit in the corners where the cold was strongest, nodding as if listening to invisible speakers, occasionally responding in words that none of the other prisoners recognized. "They're angry," she announced one night, her voice carrying across the chamber with startling clarity. "Been sleeping too long and now they're waking up. They don't like what they see." "Who's angry?" Elijah asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "The ones who were here first, before the white man, before the slaves, before any of this." Celia's eyes, though clouded by madness, held a disturbing lucidity. "This land has seen death before, child. Lots of death. And death leaves marks that don't wash away with time." Her words were interrupted by a new sound, a scraping noise that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It started as a faint scratching like mice in the walls, but gradually grew louder and more deliberate. Soon, it became clear that something was moving through the spaces between the wooden supports, something that shouldn't have been able to fit in such narrow gaps. The scraping moved in a circuit around their chamber, pausing occasionally as if listening or watching. When it stopped directly above where Elijah sat, he felt a drop of something warm and wet land on his forehead. In the darkness, he couldn't see what it was, but the metallic smell told him everything he needed to know. "Blood," Samuel whispered, having noticed the same thing. "Something's bleeding up there." The implications were terrifying. The space between the ceiling of their chamber and the ground above was barely 2 feet high, not enough room for a person to crawl through. Yet something was clearly moving through that narrow gap, something that was injured or worse. As the nights passed, the phenomena intensified. Prisoners began reporting sightings of figures moving in the darkness, shapes that seemed to absorb what little light filtered down from above. These figures never approached directly, always staying at the edge of perception, but their presence was unmistakable. One night, a young man named Thomas, who had been brought to the quarters just days before Elijah, simply vanished. He had been sleeping against the far wall when the others went to sleep, but when morning came, he was gone. There was no way he could have escaped. The only exit was through the ceiling, and the guards above would have seen him. Yet his sleeping spot was empty, with only a strange, sweet smell lingering in the air where he had been. "They took him," Celia said matter-of-factly when the others discovered Thomas's absence. "He was young and strong. They like the young ones." "Who took him?" Samuel demanded, his voice tight with fear and anger. "The hungry ones, the ones who'd been waiting so long they forgot what it was like to be alive." Celia's voice dropped to a whisper. "They remember now, though. All this fresh suffering, all this new death, it's waking them up, making them remember what they used to be. The guards above seemed unconcerned by Thomas's disappearance. When Samuel called up to report it during the daily food delivery, Garrett's response was dismissive. Probably crawled off to die somewhere quiet. They do that sometimes like sick animals. We'll find the body eventually. But Elijah knew that wasn't what had happened. He had been awake when Thomas disappeared, and what he had witnessed defied all rational explanation. In the deepest part of the night, when the cold was at its most intense, he had seen shapes emerge from the walls themselves, not through gaps or openings, but literally passing through the solid wood and earth as if they were made of nothing more substantial than smoke. These shapes had surrounded Thomas's sleeping form, and though Elijah couldn't see clearly in the darkness, he could hear whispered words in that same ancient language that Celia sometimes spoke. Thomas had stirred, then sat up with an expression of strange calm on his face. Without a word, he had stood and walked toward the far wall, the shadowy figures moving with him. When they reached the wall, Thomas had simply stepped through it, as if it were an open doorway. The shapes had followed, and then there was nothing but the lingering sweet smell and the sound of distant laughter echoing from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Elijah had told no one what he had seen, partly because he wasn't sure anyone would believe him, and partly because he feared what it might mean for his own survival. If the things in the darkness were taking prisoners, how long before they came for him? The answer came sooner than he expected. 3 nights after Thomas's disappearance, Elijah was awakened by the sensation of being watched. He opened his eyes to find a figure standing over him. Not one of the other prisoners, but something else entirely. It was tall and thin, with features that seemed to shift and blur in the darkness. When it spoke, its voice was like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. "You see us," it said, and Elijah realized with horror that it was speaking directly to him. "You see us, and you understand. That makes you useful." "What do you want?" Elijah managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "What we have always wanted. What we were denied when they buried us in the dark places, when they forgot our names and our stories." The figure leaned closer, and Elijah could smell the scent of earth and decay. "We want to live again, and you, child, are going to help us." Before Elijah could respond, the figure melted back into the shadows, leaving him alone with the terrifying knowledge that he had been chosen for something far worse than simple captivity. The things in the darkness had plans for him, and for the first time since his arrival in the quarters, he began to pray, not for rescue, but for the strength to resist whatever they intended to do. In the deepest tunnels, where no living soul had walked for decades, ancient voices began to chant in languages that predated human memory, and the very foundations of the Johnson plantation began to tremble with the weight of awakening evil. 2 weeks had passed since Elijah's encounter with the shadow figure, and the atmosphere in the quarters had grown increasingly oppressive. More prisoners had vanished, always during the deepest part of the night, always without a trace. The remaining captives huddled together in the center of their chamber, afraid to sleep near the walls where the disappearances seemed to occur. Samuel had taken on the role of unofficial leader among the survivors, organizing them into groups that would take turns staying awake to watch for the shadow figures. But their vigilance seemed to make little difference. The entities that stalked the tunnels appeared to be growing bolder, no longer content to simply observe from the darkness. "They're getting stronger," Celia observed during one of her increasingly lucid moments. "Each person they take, each drop of fear they drink, it feeds them, makes them more real." She pointed toward the walls with a trembling finger. "Look at the wood. See how it's changing." Elijah followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. The wooden supports that lined their chamber were indeed changing, but not in any way that made sense. The grain of the wood seemed to be moving, flowing like water, and in some places, What looked like faces were emerging from the surface, twisted, agonized expressions that seemed to watch the prisoners with hungry eyes. "It's the wood from the old burial ground," Celia continued, her voice taking on the sing-song quality that indicated she was channeling information from sources beyond the living world. When Master Johnson's grandfather built these quarters, he used timber from trees that had grown over the bones of the forgotten dead. The wood remembers. The wood hungers. The revelation explained much about the quarter's malevolent atmosphere. The very structure of their prison was infused with the essence of those who had died in anguish, their suffering absorbed into the grain of the wood over decades of exposure to human misery. But it was the discovery of the lower levels that truly revealed the scope of the horror they faced. During his third week in captivity, Elijah had been exploring the furthest reaches of their chamber when he found a section of the floor that felt different under his feet. The wooden planks here were loose, and when he pried them up with his fingers, he discovered a narrow opening that led to another level below. The smell that rose from the opening was indescribable, a mixture of decay, ancient earth, and something else that made his primitive instincts scream warnings of danger. But curiosity and desperation drove him to investigate further. Using a piece of rope he had found among the debris, he lowered himself into the opening. What he found below defied all rational explanation. The lower level was not a constructed chamber like the ones above, but rather a natural cave system that extended far beyond the boundaries of the plantation. The walls were lined with symbols that predated any known writing system, carved deep into the stone by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago. But it was the occupants of these caves that truly horrified him. Scattered throughout the tunnels were the remains of those who had been taken from the upper chambers, not just recent disappearances like Thomas, but dozens of others whose bones had been picked clean by time and whatever else dwelt in the darkness. They had been arranged in ritualistic patterns, their skulls facing toward a central chamber where something far more disturbing waited. In the heart of the cave system, Elijah discovered what could only be described as an altar. It was carved from a single piece of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and its surface was covered with channels that had been worn smooth by the passage of countless offerings. Around the altar, the walls were covered with more symbols, but these were different, fresher, as if they had been carved recently. As he studied the symbols, Elijah began to understand their meaning through some instinct that bypassed rational thought. They told the story of a people who had lived on this land long before European colonization, a people who had practiced rituals that bound the spirits of the dead to the physical world. When they had been driven from their homeland by disease and warfare, they had performed one final ceremony, a curse that would ensure their spirits remained tied to the land, waiting for the right conditions to return to the world of the living. The Johnson plantation, with its systematic brutality and endless supply of suffering souls, had provided exactly those conditions. Each death in the quarters, each moment of despair and anguish had fed the ancient spirits and given them strength. Now, after decades of feeding, they were strong enough to take physical form once again. But they needed more than just strength. They needed bodies, living vessels that could house their ancient consciousness and allow them to walk the earth once more. The prisoners who had been taken had not been killed, Elijah realized with growing horror. They had been possessed, their souls displaced to make room for entities that had been waiting centuries for this opportunity. The sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnels interrupted his horrifying revelation. But these were not the shuffling steps of fellow prisoners. They moved with purpose and coordination that spoke of intelligence and planning. Elijah quickly extinguished his makeshift torch and pressed himself against the wall, hoping to remain hidden in the darkness. What emerged from the deeper tunnels confirmed his worst fears. The figures that approached the altar were unmistakably human in shape, but their movements were wrong, too fluid, too coordinated, as if they were being controlled by something that didn't quite understand how human bodies were supposed to work. In the dim light that seemed to emanate from the altar itself, Elijah could see their faces, and his heart nearly stopped. It was Thomas, along with several other prisoners who had vanished over the past weeks. But their eyes held no recognition, no humanity, only an ancient hunger that had finally found a way to satisfy itself. They moved in perfect synchronization, arranging themselves around the altar in preparation for some ritual that Elijah knew he could not allow to continue. As he watched in horror, more figures emerged from the tunnels, not just the recently possessed, but others whose bodies showed signs of longer occupation. Some wore the tattered remains of clothing that dated back decades, while others were dressed in the simple garments of enslaved people from even earlier periods. The ancient spirits had been collecting vessels for far longer than anyone had realized. The possessed began to chant in that same ancient language that Celia sometimes spoke, their voices harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords should not have been able to achieve. The sound seemed to resonate through the stone itself, and Elijah could feel the vibrations in his bones. The altar began to glow with a sickly green light, and the symbols on the walls started to pulse in rhythm with the chanting. Elijah knew he had to escape, had to warn the others about what was happening in the depths below their prison. But as he turned to leave, he found his path blocked by another figure, one that he recognized with a shock of terror and grief. It was his own father, who had died 2 years earlier while working in the fields of their previous plantation. But the thing wearing his father's face smiled with an expression of malevolent satisfaction that his gentle father had never possessed. "Hello, son," it said in a voice that was almost, but not quite, the one Elijah remembered. "We've been waiting for you to find us. Now the real work can begin." As the possessed figures closed in around him, Elijah realized that his discovery of the lower chambers had not been an accident. He had been guided here, led by forces that had been manipulating events from the very beginning. The ancient spirits didn't just want to possess random prisoners, they wanted him specifically, for reasons that he was only beginning to understand. In the growing light of the altar, as hands that had once belonged to people he knew reached out to claim him, Elijah finally understood the true scope of the horror that lay beneath the Johnson plantation. This was not just a prison for the living. It was a nursery for the dead, a place where ancient evils could gestate and grow until they were strong enough to reclaim the world above. And he was about to become their newest vessel. The possessed figures surrounded Elijah in the chamber beneath the quarters, their movements unnaturally coordinated as they formed a circle around the black stone altar. The thing wearing his father's face stepped forward, its smile a grotesque parody of the warmth Elijah remembered from his childhood. "Do not fear, my son," it said, its voice carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. "What we offer is not death, but transformation. You will become part of something far greater than your mortal flesh could ever achieve." Elijah backed against the carved wall, feeling the ancient symbols pressing into his spine. The stone seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and he could sense the presence of countless spirits pressing against the boundaries between worlds, eager to claim physical form once again. "Why me?" he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible above the low chanting that continued to emanate from the possessed figures. The entity inhabiting his father's body tilted its head with an expression of mock consideration. "You have the sight, child. You see us when others cannot. You hear our voices when others hear only wind. Such gifts are rare among your kind, and they make you compatible with our needs." As if to demonstrate its point, the creature gestured toward the walls, and Elijah gasped as the carved symbols began to glow with the same sickly green light that emanated from the altar. But more than that, He could suddenly understand their meaning as clearly as if they were written in English. The symbols told the story of the original inhabitants of this land, a people who had mastered the art of binding souls to physical locations, ensuring that death was merely a temporary inconvenience rather than a final ending. "Your ancestors knew the old ways," the entity continued, and Elijah realized with growing horror that it was speaking the truth. "The blood that flows in your veins carries the memory of rituals performed in the deep forests, of ceremonies that opened doorways between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. That is why you can see us, why you can hear us. That is why you are perfect for our purposes." The revelation hit Elijah like a physical blow. His grandmother had always spoken of their family's connection to the old traditions, the African practices that had been suppressed but never entirely forgotten. She had taught him to see signs and portents in the natural world, to listen for voices that others could not hear. He had thought it was simply folklore, stories to comfort enslaved people who had lost everything else. Now he understood that it was something far more significant and far more dangerous. "The ritual requires a willing vessel," the entity explained, its borrowed features taking on an expression of patient instruction. "We could simply take you, as we have taken the others, but the binding would be incomplete. Your consciousness would fight against ours, weakening the connection between spirit and flesh. But if you choose to accept us willingly, I'll never help you," Elijah said, though his voice shook with fear. The creature's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for a human mouth. "Oh, but you will, child, because we have something that you want very much indeed." It gestured toward the deeper tunnels, and Elijah heard footsteps approaching from the darkness. What emerged made his heart stop with a mixture of joy and terror. It was his sister Mercy, who had been sold away from their family 3 years earlier when she was only 8 years old. But like the others, her eyes held no recognition, no warmth, only the cold intelligence of something ancient and hungry. "She has been with us for some time now," the entity said, watching Elijah's face carefully. "We found her at a plantation in South Carolina, where she had been worked nearly to death. We offered her relief from her suffering, and she accepted gratefully. She has been quite useful to us, helping to prepare the way for our return." Elijah stared at his sister's possessed form, seeing traces of the little girl he remembered beneath the alien intelligence that now controlled her movements. The entity was right. He would do anything to save her, even if it meant sacrificing himself. "If I agree to your terms," he said slowly, "what happens to her? What happens to all of them? They become part of us, as you will become part of us. Their individual consciousness fades, but their essence remains, contributing to our collective strength. In time, they will not remember their former lives, but they will know peace, the peace of being part of something eternal and powerful." It was a lie, Elijah knew. The thing speaking through his father's mouth was offering oblivion disguised as transcendence. But what choice did he have? If he refused, they would simply take him by force, and Mercy would remain trapped forever. At least if he agreed willingly, there might be some chance of finding a way to free her. "I need time to consider," he said, hoping to buy himself a few precious moments to think. The entity laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "Time is something we have in abundance, child. We have waited centuries for this moment. A few more hours will make no difference, but do not think to escape or to warn the others above. This chamber exists outside the normal flow of time and space. You could wander these tunnels for eternity and never find your way back to the world of the living." As if to prove its point, the creature gestured toward the tunnel through which Elijah had entered the chamber. The opening was gone, replaced by solid stone that showed no sign of ever having been disturbed. He was trapped, cut off from any hope of rescue or escape. the possessed figures began to disperse, moving back into the deeper tunnels with that same unnatural coordination. Only the entity wearing his father's face remained, along with his sister's possessed form. "We will return when the moon reaches its zenith," it said. "That is when the barriers between worlds are thinnest, when the ritual will be most effective. Use the time wisely, child. Contemplate the gift we offer and prepare yourself to join us willingly." They left him alone in the chamber with the pulsing altar and the glowing symbols, surrounded by the bones of those who had been brought here before him. But Elijah was not entirely alone. He could feel the presence of other spirits in the chamber, entities that had not been strong enough to claim physical form, but that lingered in the spaces between the carved symbols. These were the original inhabitants of the land, he realized, not the ancient spirits that sought to possess the living, but the ghosts of those who had been displaced and forgotten when the plantation was built. They had been watching the proceedings with growing alarm, understanding that the return of the Ancient Ones would mean the final destruction of any hope for peace or rest. One of these spirits, a woman whose form flickered like candlelight in the green glow of the altar, approached him with an expression of desperate urgency. "You must not let them complete the ritual," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of autumn leaves. "If they succeed in binding themselves to willing vessels, they will have the power to spread beyond this place. They will consume everything in their path, turning the entire world into a feeding ground for their hunger." "How can I stop them?" Elijah asked. "I'm just one person, and they have my sister." "The altar is the key," the spirit replied. "It is the focal point of their power, the anchor that allows them to maintain their hold on this realm. If it could be destroyed, they would be banished back to wherever they came from." "Not banished, destroyed. The ritual that bound them to this place also made them dependent on it. Without the altar, they would simply cease to exist." The spirit began to fade as the green light from the altar pulsed brighter, but her final words reached him clearly. "The symbols on the walls, they are not just decorative. They are instructions, a guide to the ritual that created this place. If you can understand them, you can reverse what was done." Elijah turned his attention to the carved symbols, using the unnatural clarity that the entity had awakened in him to decipher their meaning. What he found was both horrifying and hopeful. The ancient spirits had indeed bound themselves to the physical world through a complex ritual that used the altar as a focal point. But the same ritual that had given them power had also created a weakness, a way to sever their connection to the physical realm permanently. The process would require a willing sacrifice, someone who understood the true nature of the binding and who possessed the spiritual sensitivity to manipulate the forces involved. It would mean his death, but it would also mean the destruction of the ancient spirits and the freedom of all those they had possessed. As the green light continued to pulse around him, Elijah began to prepare for the most important decision of his short life. In a few hours, when the moon reached its zenith, he would have to choose between saving himself and saving everyone else, including his sister, whose soul was trapped somewhere within her possessed body. The spirits of the original inhabitants gathered around him, their flickering forms offering what comfort they could as he studied the symbols and prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. In the distance, he could hear the Ancient Ones beginning their final preparations, their inhuman voices rising in anticipation of their long-awaited triumph. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that a 12-year-old boy would choose his own survival over the greater good. They were about to learn just how wrong they could be. The moon had reached its zenith above the Virginia plantation, though its light could not penetrate the depths where Elijah waited beside the black stone altar. The possessed figures had returned, filling the chamber with their unnatural presence as they prepared for the ritual that would complete their return to the physical world. The entity wearing his father's face approached him with an expression of satisfied anticipation. "Have you made your decision, child? Will you accept our gift willingly, or must we take what we require by force?" Elijah looked at his sister's possessed form, seeing the faint flicker of her true self, buried deep within the alien intelligence that controlled her movements. He had spent the hours since their departure, studying the symbols on the walls, learning the intricacies of the binding ritual that had created this nightmare. More importantly, he had discovered how to reverse it. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady, despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "I'll accept your offer willingly, but I have one condition." The entity's borrowed features showed amusement. "You are hardly in a position to make demands, child. I want to understand the ritual completely before I submit to it. I want to know exactly what will happen to me, to my sister, to all of them." Elijah gestured toward the other possessed figures. "If I'm going to give up my humanity willingly, I deserve to know what I'm becoming." The creature considered this request for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. Knowledge is power, and power shared is power doubled. You shall understand everything." What followed was a detailed explanation of the binding process, delivered in the ancient language that Elijah could now understand as clearly as English. The entity described how the original ritual had been performed, how the spirits had anchored themselves to the physical world through the sacrifice of their own people, and how they had waited centuries for the right conditions to manifest physical forms once again. But in its arrogance, the entity revealed more than it intended. It explained the precise sequence of the ritual, the specific words and gestures required to complete the binding, and most importantly, the exact moment when the process would be most vulnerable to disruption. "The binding requires a moment of perfect synchronization," the entity explained, its voice taking on the cadence of a teacher instructing a favored student. "All participants must speak the words of power simultaneously, while the altar channels the spiritual energy of the willing sacrifice. At the moment of peak resonance, the barriers between worlds dissolve completely, allowing us to claim our new vessels permanently." Elijah nodded, as if fascinated by the explanation, while mentally noting every detail that might be useful in his plan to destroy them. The spirits of the original inhabitants flickered at the edges of his vision, offering silent encouragement as he prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. "I'm ready," he said finally. "Let's begin." The possessed figures arranged themselves around the altar in a complex pattern that mirrored the symbols carved into the walls. Each took their position with mechanical precision, their movements coordinated by the collective intelligence that controlled them. Elijah was placed at the center, directly above the altar's focal point, while his sister's possessed form stood at his right hand. The entity wearing his father's face began the incantation, its voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to resonate through the stone itself. The other possessed figures joined in, their voices harmonizing in ways that created overtones and frequencies that human vocal cords should not have been able to produce. The altar began to glow more brightly, its black surface becoming translucent as spiritual energy flowed through the channels carved into its surface. Elijah could feel the power building around him, a pressure that seemed to compress his very soul as the barriers between worlds began to weaken. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the point of maximum vulnerability that the entity had unknowingly revealed to him. As the chanting reached its crescendo and the altar's glow became almost blinding, Elijah began his own incantation. But instead of the words of binding that the ancient spirits expected, he spoke the words of unbinding that he had deciphered from the wall symbols. The language was the same, but the intent was completely opposite. Where the original ritual had sought to anchor the spirits to the physical world, his counter-ritual sought to sever those connections permanently. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The harmonious chanting of the possessed figures became discordant as Elijah's words disrupted the carefully orchestrated ritual. The entity wearing his father's face spun toward him with an expression of shocked rage. "What are you doing?" it screamed, its voice no longer maintaining the pretense of humanity. "What I have to do," Elijah replied, continuing the counter-incantation even as the possessed figures began to converge on him. "I'm sending you back where you belong." The altar's glow began to fluctuate wildly as the competing rituals fought for dominance. Cracks appeared in the black stone, spreading outward from the focal point where Elijah stood. The symbols on the walls began to pulse erratically, some growing brighter while others faded completely. The possessed figures reached for him with hands that no longer looked entirely human, their fingers extending into claws as the ancient spirits abandoned any pretense of maintaining their stolen forms. But they were too late. The counter-ritual had reached the point of no return, and the spiritual energy that had sustained them for centuries was beginning to unravel. "You don't understand what you're doing," the entity shrieked as its borrowed body began to flicker like a candle in the wind. "Without us, this place will collapse. The tunnels, the chambers, everything will fall." Elijah had known this would be the cost of his actions. The entire underground complex had been sustained by the spiritual energy of the Ancient Ones, and without that power, the earthworks would collapse back into the natural cave system from which they had been carved. Everyone still trapped in the quarters above would be buried alive. But he had also discovered something else in his study of the wall symbols, a way to redirect the collapsing spiritual energy to create a different kind of escape. Instead of simply destroying the ancient spirits, he could use their own power to tear open a permanent gateway between the underground chambers and the surface world. As the counter-ritual reached its climax, Elijah made a final modification to the incantation, adding words that would channel the released energy upward rather than simply dissipating it into the void. The effect was like setting off an explosion in reverse. Instead of destroying everything around it, the spiritual energy began to carve a path through the earth above, creating a tunnel that led directly to the surface. The possessed figures began to scream as their stolen bodies dissolved around them, the ancient spirits finally being torn away from the physical world they had claimed. But in their dissolution, Elijah could see the true souls of the possessed. His sister, Thomas, his father, and all the others finally being released from their spiritual bondage. Mercy's eyes met his for just a moment as her true self flickered back into existence, and he saw recognition and gratitude there before she faded into whatever peaceful realm awaited the truly dead. It was enough. She was free, and that was all that mattered. The altar cracked completely in half as the last of the ancient spirits was banished, and the chamber began to shake as the spiritual foundations of the underground complex finally gave way. But the tunnel Elijah had created was holding, and he could see starlight far above as the pathway to freedom opened before him. He had just enough time to smile before the collapsing chamber claimed him, his sacrifice complete and his purpose fulfilled. The ancient evil that had fed on suffering for centuries was finally destroyed, and the souls of the innocent were free to find their rest. Above ground, the surviving prisoners in the quarters felt the earth shake beneath their feet as the underground complex collapsed. But they also saw something miraculous, a shaft of moonlight suddenly piercing the darkness as a tunnel opened in the ceiling of their chamber, leading directly to the surface and freedom. The collapse of the underground chambers sent tremors through the entire Johnson plantation, waking everyone from the main house to the overseer's quarters. As the earth settled and the dust cleared, a miraculous sight greeted those who ventured outside to investigate the disturbance. Where once there had been only the heavy wooden doors set into the ground, a gaping hole now opened directly to the surface, revealing the horrors that had been hidden beneath the Virginia soil for generations. The surviving prisoners, Samuel, Celia, and a handful of others who had endured weeks or months in the underground hell, emerged blinking into the moonlight like souls returning from the dead. Master Johnson arrived at the scene in his nightclothes, his face pale with shock as he stared into the exposed chambers. The carefully constructed facade of his family's disciplinary quarters lay in ruins, revealing the true scope of the cruelty that had been practiced on his land. But more disturbing than the physical evidence were the stories that the survivors began to tell. Samuel, his voice hoarse from weeks of whispering in the darkness, spoke of the ancient spirits that had possessed the missing prisoners, of the rituals performed in chambers carved from living rock, and of the young boy who had sacrificed himself to destroy an evil that predated the plantation itself. His words were supported by Celia, whose madness had been replaced by a startling clarity now that the spiritual oppression had been lifted. "The boy saved us all," she said, her eyes clear for the first time in years. "He saw what we couldn't see, understood what we couldn't understand. He gave his life so that the hungry ones could never feed again." The physical evidence supported their incredible claims. In the deepest part of the collapsed chambers, searchers found the remains of the black stone altar, split cleanly in half and surrounded by bones that dated back far longer than the plantation's existence. The walls were covered with symbols that no one could read, though scholars who examined them later would identify them as belonging to a pre-Columbian culture that had vanished from historical records centuries earlier. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the wooden supports that had lined the chambers. As Samuel had claimed, they were indeed carved from trees that had grown over ancient burial grounds, and the grain of the wood showed clear evidence of faces, twisted, agonized expressions that seemed to watch observers with hungry eyes. When the wood was burned, witnesses reported hearing screams that seemed to come from the flames themselves. The revelation of the quarter's true nature sent shockwaves through Virginia's plantation society. Word spread quickly among the enslaved population, carried by those who had been freed from the underground chambers and by others who had heard rumors of the Johnson family's unusual methods of discipline. The story grew in the telling, becoming a legend of resistance and sacrifice that would be passed down through generations. For the Johnson family, the exposure meant social and economic ruin. No respectable planter would associate with them once the truth became known, and their enslaved workforce began to disappear as word spread of what had happened beneath their land. Within a year, the plantation was abandoned, its fields returning to wilderness as nature reclaimed what had been taken from it. But the most significant change was in the survivors themselves. Samuel used his freedom to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping other enslaved people escape to the north. He carried with him the story of Elijah's sacrifice, using it to inspire others to resist oppression and to remind them that even in the darkest circumstances, hope could survive. Celia, her mind restored by the lifting of the spiritual oppression, became a keeper of the old traditions, teaching others about the spiritual forces that could both enslave and liberate the human soul. She spoke often of the young boy who had understood the true nature of sacrifice, not as a surrender to evil, but as a weapon against it. The site of the former plantation became a place of pilgrimage for those who had heard the story. They came to pay their respects to Elijah and to the countless others who had suffered and died in the underground chambers. Over time, a small community grew up around the site, populated by former enslaved people and their descendants who wanted to ensure that the story would never be forgotten. As the years passed and the American Revolution transformed the political landscape of Virginia, the legend of the Johnson plantation took on new meaning. It became a symbol of the hidden horrors that slavery could produce, but also of the power of individual courage to overcome even supernatural evil. Abolitionists used the story to illustrate the moral corruption that slavery brought to both enslaved and enslaver, while those who had experienced slavery firsthand saw it as proof that no oppression, no matter how complete, could destroy the human spirit. The tunnel that Elijah had created with his sacrifice remained open, a permanent reminder of the price of freedom. During the day, sunlight streamed down into the chambers below, illuminating spaces that had known only darkness for decades. At night, the moonlight created patterns on the chamber walls that seemed to tell stories of their own, stories of suffering overcome, of evil defeated, and of a young boy whose courage had literally moved heaven and earth. In the years that followed, other plantations throughout the South began to abandon their most brutal practices, partly due to changing economic conditions, but also because of the fear that their own cruelties might awaken forces beyond their control. The story of the Johnson plantation served as a warning that some forms of oppression carried consequences that extended far beyond the physical world. As the 19th century dawned and the movement to abolish slavery gained momentum, the legend of Elijah and the underground chambers became part of the larger narrative of resistance and liberation. It reminded all who heard it that freedom was not just a political concept, but a spiritual necessity, and that those who would deny it to others did so at their own peril. The site itself remained a place of power, where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds seemed thinner than elsewhere. Visitors reported feeling a sense of peace there, as if the suffering that had once saturated the ground had been transformed into something healing. Some claimed to see a young boy in the moonlight standing at the edge of the tunnel that led to freedom, watching over those who came seeking hope in their darkest hours. And in the deepest part of the night, when the wind was just right, those who listened carefully could hear voices rising from the earth. Not the hungry whispers of ancient evil, but the songs of the liberated, celebrating a victory that had been won not through violence or hatred, but through the ultimate act of love, the willingness of one soul to sacrifice everything so that others might be free. The macabre slave quarters of the Johnsons had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of sacrifice and the ultimate triumph of light over darkness. The story spread beyond Virginia's borders, carried by freed slaves, abolitionists, and even some former slaveholders who had been shaken by the revelation of what horrors could lurk beneath the veneer of civilized society. In the decades that followed, as America grappled with the moral contradictions of slavery and eventually fought a civil war to resolve them, the legend of Elijah's sacrifice took on prophetic significance. Many saw in his story a foreshadowing of the greater sacrifice that would be required to purge the nation of its original sin. The boy who had given his life to destroy an ancient evil became a symbol of the price that freedom would ultimately demand. The tunnel he had created remained a pilgrimage site long after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. Former slaves and their descendants would travel hundreds of miles to stand at the edge of that opening and pay their respects to the child who had understood that some evils could only be defeated through complete self-sacrifice. They would leave flowers, carved wooden tokens, and sometimes just stones, simple markers of remembrance for a boy whose name had become synonymous with liberation. Scholars and historians who studied the site in later years found evidence that supported the survivors' incredible claims. Archaeological excavations revealed the remains of a pre-Columbian settlement that had been built over an even older burial ground. Carbon dating of the bones found in the deepest chambers confirmed that some were centuries older than the plantation itself, lending credence to the stories of ancient spirits that had been awakened by the systematic cruelty practiced above their resting place. The wooden supports that had lined the chambers became objects of particular study. When examined under microscopes, the grain patterns revealed structures that defied natural explanation, formations that looked disturbingly like human neural networks, as if the wood had somehow absorbed and retained the consciousness of those who had suffered within its embrace. Several pieces were preserved in museums, though visitors often reported feeling uneasy in their presence, as if something within the wood was still watching, still remembering. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was made in the 1920s when a team of archaeologists found a small chamber that had been sealed off from the main tunnel system. Inside, they discovered the preserved remains of a young boy, positioned as if he had been kneeling in prayer when death claimed him. Around his body were carved symbols that matched those found throughout the underground complex. But these were different. They spoke not of binding and imprisonment, but of release and transcendence. The boy's remains were identified through dental records and other evidence as those of Elijah, the child whose sacrifice had destroyed the ancient evil and freed the trapped souls. But what made the discovery truly extraordinary was the condition of the body itself. Despite having been buried for over a century and a half, the remains showed no signs of decay or corruption. The flesh had been preserved as if by some supernatural force, and the face bore an expression of perfect peace. More remarkable still was what happened when the chamber was opened to the outside air. As sunlight touched the preserved body for the first time since Elijah's death, witnesses reported seeing a brief flash of golden light, and then the remains simply faded away, leaving behind only the carved symbols and a sense of profound tranquility that lingered in the chamber for days afterward. The event was witnessed by dozens of people, including skeptical scientists and journalists who had come to debunk what they assumed would be another hoax. Instead, they found themselves confronted with evidence of something that challenged their understanding of the natural world. The story made headlines across the country, renewing interest in the legend and bringing new pilgrims to the site. In the years that followed, the area around the former Johnson plantation was designated as a historical site, protected by both state and federal law. A small museum was built nearby, dedicated to preserving the story of the underground chambers and the boy who had sacrificed himself to destroy the evil that dwelt within them. The exhibits included artifacts recovered from the chambers, testimonies from survivors and their descendants, and detailed reconstructions of the underground complex based on archaeological evidence. But the most powerful exhibit was the simplest, a small plaque placed at the edge of the tunnel that Elijah had created, bearing only his name and the dates of his birth and death. Visitors would stand there in silence, looking down into the depths where unimaginable horrors had once flourished, and up at the sky where freedom beckoned to all who had the courage to reach for it. The story of the Macabre slave quarters became required reading in schools throughout the region, taught not as a ghost story or supernatural tale, but as a historical account of the extremes to which human cruelty could extend, and the equally extreme measures that were sometimes required to overcome it. Children learned about Elijah not as a mythical figure, but as a real boy who had faced an impossible choice and made the decision that saved countless others. As the 20th century progressed and America continued to grapple with the legacy of slavery and racial injustice, the story took on new relevance. Civil rights leaders would invoke Elijah's name when calling for sacrifice and commitment to the cause of justice. They reminded their followers that freedom had never come without a price, and that sometimes the greatest victories required the greatest sacrifices. The site itself remained a place of pilgrimage and reflection, drawing visitors from around the world who came to pay their respects to the boy who had literally moved heaven and earth to secure freedom for others. On quiet nights, when the moon was full and the wind was still, some claimed they could still hear voices rising from the depths, not the hungry whispers of ancient evil, but the joyful songs of the liberated, celebrating a victory that had echoed through the centuries. And in the morning, when the first rays of sunlight streamed down through the tunnel that Elijah had created with his sacrifice, the light seemed to carry with it a message of hope, a reminder that no darkness, no matter how deep or how ancient, could ultimately prevail against the power of a single soul willing to give everything for the freedom of others. The macabre slave quarters of the Johnsons had become something far more powerful than their creators had ever intended. Not a monument to cruelty and oppression, but a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit and the ultimate triumph of light over darkness. In the end, the boy who had descended into hell had not only found his way back to the light, he had brought that light with him, illuminating the path to freedom for all